All right. I've never thought about how to start this. Should we say hi?
Yeah. Okay, wait.
Okay.
Yeah, we can just say, like, you want to say, like, oh, yeah, we can. I didn't have to roll.
Hi, I'm Kenneth.
And I'm Maya. Welcome to Journey to the Double Doc. We are incoming MD PhD students at Penn and Harvard MIT, and we wanted to create this channel to chronicle our training paths.
We hope to share things that we learned along the way that we wish we had known, as well just as to be a general resource for those interested and passionate about science and medicine. So feel free to contact us at our Twitter handles or our email. We would love to hear what you want us to talk about, and so welcome to our channel and hope you will join us on our journey. I was like...
And I was like, oh my god, like, why are you talking about this? Is like your first impression.
Hi, everybody. I know it's been a while since we posted, but wrapping up our second semesters and just wanted to do a couple of videos where we respond to video requests that we found in our comments or people have reached out to us asking advice on particular topics. So this one is from Little War 195 asking us to make a video about gap years and as this person's like thinking about taking one or not. And so thankfully, Maya and I both had different decisions about this. And so it would be good for us to talk through each of our reasoning and for you to learn why we each chose what we ended up choosing to do so. So not too mysterious about it, I took a gap year, Maya didn't take a gap year. So maybe Maya, if you want to start on just like giving us like the top line of like why you didn't choose to take a gap year.
Yeah, definitely. So as Kenneth mentioned, I didn't take a gap year, so I started my MD PhD pretty much straight from college, basically just a month before I graduated just a month before I started my first rotation. And for me, when I was thinking about the decision of whether or not to take a gap year, I thought of a few things. The first was whether I felt like my application would be like significantly improved by taking a gap year. And for me, one thing that I really thought about what I would do during a gap year would be probably another research experience, which I think is really common for MD PhD students. But for me, I had kind of had the opportunity to not only do sort of a long-term research experience in college at Columbia, but also some shorter summer experiences at different institutions. I did one at HMS and also one at Cold Spring Harbor Labs. And I felt like through those experiences, I have been able to sort of like both build up my research portfolio and also kind of experience like different institutions, like gone outside of my college, etc. So I felt like the personal benefit to taking a gap year to bump up my research experience, both in terms of like what admissions committees would look for, but also in terms of like me being able to experience a research environment was probably not substantial enough that I wanted to delay for another year or 2 years, which is often common for MD PhD applicants. And then I think on like a more personal note, I already knew like the program I was going into was long. I kind of wanted to be able to start sooner rather than later. But at the same time, I also think that in the grand scheme of things, because things are so long, like an additional year here or there, like probably doesn't make a huge difference. And I think coming from undergrad, it was easy to feel like I kind of like, it would be super easy to push through. But I definitely think actually a year out, I think that taking a gap year is actually something I would consider more. So that's kind of on the flip side of someone who decided not to take a gap year.
And I guess I wonder, now that you're a year in, can you talk about reflecting on like maybe the transition? I know it was during COVID, but the transition straight out of undergrad. Could you talk a little bit about things that you've reflected on or noticed about going straight through?
Yeah. So I think pretty much all of my classmates and both of my roommates took a gap year coming from college. And I think that one of the biggest things that I sort of appreciated from them and talking to them about their gap year experiences was that they had a little bit more time to kind of like breathe and sort of adjust between like going from college to like going into med school and like especially going into med school and MD PhD program. It really is kind of the start of your career in a way that nothing else really had been up until that point. So I think for me, like I still felt felt good. I think in some ways, like coming straight from school, it made it easy to like stay in the school mode and not feel like I like haven't been working for a year and now I'm like going to go back and like take classes and take tests and stuff like that. But maybe on the flip side, I think that for my roommates who did take a gap year or my classmates, like it also gave them an opportunity to kind of unwind and still like have a very productive gap year and still do a lot of stuff in terms of like research and shadowing experience and things like that, while also being able to get a chance to sort of breathe. And I think that, being in med school now and like experiencing what med school is, like it really is just like a whole nother level of crazy from undergrad. And I really love it, but I definitely can see like how taking some extra time off just to like prepare and like if there's stuff you want to do like travel or other things that don't neatly fit into like the MD PhD pipeline once you start, like it's a really a great opportunity to do it because it's probably one of the last times where you won't have like true obligations. Obviously, you might be like working in a lab or something, but it's a little bit different once you're like, for example, starting rotations or starting your PhD, and like this is like really directly affecting like what you're going to be doing during your MD PhD training.
Yeah, and I think like at least on my end, so having taken that gap year, a lot of those things are very true. I think one thing to add was maybe this is just me as a person and how lazy I am, but I also found the fact that I felt that it was easier for me to very much lean in on the pass fail aspect of preclinical, where I like am honestly like doing the literal bare minimum. Like on my past exams, the passing is 75. I got a 73.75 on one of them and they let me pass. And then the one I just got back was I got a 76. So I literally have been like doing the exact bare minimum to pass my classes. And I think like it's having that time between school, like straight from undergrad and into med school, just made it easier for me to like let go of like the very much like I got to know everything, like I got to study a lot kind of mentality, and that has opened up more time. Like this semester, like I'm reading, which I haven't done in years, like, and so it's like very weird, but also it's just something that um, I found personally doing my gap year, how that has impacted my experience in my first year here so far. And to do a few steps back, I ended up taking a gap year because I felt I wasn't ready to apply between mostly because of my lack of clinical experience, because I ended up not really knowing that I wanted to do an MD PhD until towards the end of my junior year. I had thought that I was going to do a PhD after college. And then at some point, I decided that an MD PhD is something that was worth considering and exploring. And so that meant that for me, it was important to understand the clinical practice of physician scientists. And so I needed the time to gain that clinical exposure to be confident for myself that the physician scientist track was right for me or is right for me, which I totally think it is. But yeah, and so that was the primary motivator. Of couple of things about my gap year experience that might be noteworthy is I graduated in December of 2018. I'm class of 2019, so a semester early, which allowed me to actually start in a new lab and not continue in my undergraduate lab. But by the time I was applying, I already had like 6 months worth of work in that lab, and it was also it was also C. elegans lab, which I had been in previously. So I was like able to actually have done a fair amount of work to write up about. And so that is a challenge with doing a gap year for some, especially if the goal is a 1 year gap. Starting a new lab after graduating in the summer doesn't give you much time to be able to articulate or write about the experience. Now departed Tri-I director Dr. Olaf Anderson, has made this point multiple times in multiple venues. So it's something that I think applicants need to be aware of, in that doing a 1 year gap year in a fresh new lab might not be as advantageous as one imagines. That being said, about being advantageous whether or not to do a gap year, multiple directors, including Dr. Skip Brass here at Penn, have said that students are evaluated within the context of the time they've had. meaning that if you did have the gap year, you're evaluated in the sense that what did you do with your gap year? And if you didn't have a gap year, you're evaluated in what you've done with your time since. It's not a comparison across these two subgroups of people with gap years and people without gap years. So that's something really important, I feel like, to know, because that's something that I actually did not know when I was applying. And I guess like we should also like give some numbers. Like half of my class took a gap year, and that number is about the same for the incoming class here at Penn. I don't know if Maya, you have a sense of the breakdown in your class.
I want to say it's around 50%. It might be very slightly skewed towards people who've taken gap years, a little bit more, but I think it's about 50-50 as well.
And so it's really about your experiences and like what you've been able to get out of the time you've invested in them. And that's going to translate directly in your application. So those are the considerations. That's the primary consideration in choosing whether or not to do a gap year. Are you happy and confident for really, at the end of the day, convincing yourself that you want to do an MD PhD and that you are ready for it? Because if you don't have that confidence, it's not going to translate through the application and to the reader, i.e. the outcome at the other end.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's like also worth pointing out that like even though we've talked a lot about doing a research gap year, which it definitely is like what a lot of MD PhD like candidates kind of do, like there's a lot of other options like ranging from doing research but more of like a fellowship setting. So like a lot of times people might apply to like different UK fellowships or like the Fulbright scholarship or something like that to be able to get an international research experience. And like even if that does end up being like a year versus 2 years, like because it's just such a different scenario, like such a different like setting, like I've known people who that's been like hugely enriching just personally to be able to have that experience to like go out of the United States and like do research, because like that is something, for example, that is probably harder to do like once you're in your MD PhD and like committed to a lab presumably at your institution. So, and then there's also people who do like things like outside of medicine, like whether that's like a startup that they're interested in, whether it's pursuing some other passion that's important to them. So I think the another important thing to point out is that like your gap year like can also just be a time to explore something that is also really important to you, but that doesn't necessarily fall right into preparing you to be an MD PhD candidate. And like that's great too. Like especially because a lot of people who do decide to do MD PhD do have a significant amount of research experience, and as we said, like a lot of people would end up being successful even out of undergraduate. If there is something that is really important to you that doesn't fit into like the research clinical bucket, like that's okay too, as long as you think it's something that would be really significant to pursue like during a year off or 2 years off. And like related to that, like a lot of people think that, once you get into an MD PhD program, that's it. Like you have to start in the fall. And like in general, I don't want to make it sound like that isn't the expectation. Like you should definitely plan and assume that if you do get accepted into an MD PhD program, you should be starting in the subsequent year. But deferral is still definitely an option, and that can range for, personal reasons to doing like some sort of fellowship, like an international fellowship that again is kind of this unique opportunity. So just know that like that is a possibility. It ends up being very program dependent. Like I know at Harvard that they basically don't let you to defer unless you do have like some sort of fellowship lined up. But I think it really depends on the program, so also something to be aware of. So I think our major takeaway from all this conversation is that making a gap year is definitely a difficult decision. There's definitely pros and cons to both kind of approaches, but I think the biggest thing to take away from it is like, one, do you think your application would be significantly improved by taking a gap year, both in terms of research and clinical experience? And then also, do you think your quality of life would be significantly improved by taking a gap year, both in terms of having time off to decompress, to relax, to explore new hobbies that you didn't get to do in undergrad, but also sometimes, as Kenneth mentioned, to kind of like get a break from academics and sort of like be able to enter med school feeling fresh? Or alternatively, if you're someone who just like is really excited to start, just really wants to go right away, then like also recognizing that and like understanding that it's also okay not to take a gap year if you feel good about your application. So I think the biggest thing, which is true for so many parts of the MD PhD application, is just ultimately try to do what feels right to you. So that's signing off for now.